I'm looking at the pictures of you that I can see here. Some people I know, some I don't. Welcome to everyone who's come back or is here for the first part of the afternoon. So we're continuing a long time ritual of fall Abhayagiri Daylong retreats. It used to be always in person. Now it's been for the last few years on Zoom and YouTube. And we welcome you all. The theme is compassion. Both Jill and I are teachers at Insight Santa Cruz, but speaking of self-compassion and letting go, we're gradually letting go of our teaching capacity, making room for the younger teachers, and we're sort of happy to do that. If you have a question, there will be Q&A by Ajahn Yanako, and that's at 2:30. So if you have a question, put it in the chat before that time so we can look it over. And I think that's all.
Welcome, everybody in the hall and on Zoom and on live stream as well. So I'm going to request a Dhamma talk, which is traditional. Before a monk gives a Dhamma talk, someone has to request it. And the request is made 3 times. So that's what I'm going to do. And I haven't done this before, so hang in there with me. Brahmachalo kadipati sahampati katanjali anadivaram ayachata santida satap parajaka jatika desetu damam anukampimam pajam.
All right, so having made the request for a Dhamma talk, then I will give, there's a brief Pali verse that I'll chant before giving the talk, but even before that I will light the candles and incense again. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhaṃ dhammāṃ saṅghāṃ namasami. So this begins the afternoon session. And the retreat, the theme being karuna or compassion today. So I'll probably speak for about 30 minutes and then we'll go into more sitting meditation followed by more walking meditation. And then I'll do some Q&A after that. So thinking about compassion, and I do believe this is coupled with a quality of courage as well, because to really be able to put ourselves in somebody else's situation and have strong empathy and have a sense of really caring about somebody else, then we do have to have courage as well, because everybody is at least more or less afraid of suffering. There's a sutta where somebody asks the Buddha, what is people's greatest fear. And when I was reading that sutta, I would have thought that the Buddha would have said death, but he doesn't say that. He says suffering is our greatest fear. Suffering is people's greatest fear. So, and we try desperately to avoid suffering, but in doing that, we invariably create more causes for it. So the next part of the sutta, the Buddha says, what they fear is suffering, and they go about their lives bringing about the very thing they fear, trying to avoid it. So what are the real causes for suffering, and what are the real causes for ending of suffering? So one is just being able to be present with suffering. That's the first noble truth. And so that's an act of compassion towards ourselves, being able to be present for suffering. And it takes courage to actually acknowledge it. And I remember when Lumpur Sumedho was here for a month last year, and something he said really stuck with me, and I tried to use it as a contemplation for myself, is that he said, you know, he's had all these difficulties in his life, and all these, he's had people criticize him. He's been praised as well. He's actually had people betray him and deceive him, and he's made his own mistakes. And he said, no matter how hard you try, you can't avoid those types of situations. So you might try in your life to avoid difficulties, avoid criticism, avoid betrayal, avoid all these things, avoid pain. And yet, no matter how hard you try, they're still going to happen. That's just the nature of existence. No matter how hard we try to avoid those things, they're still going to happen. And so what we do is we develop that courage that's willing to look directly at these things and not shy away from them. Because when we try to reorganize everything in our life to avoid any type of criticism, any type of pain, any type of suffering, then inevitably in that agitation where we're trying to avoid all those things, then we end up creating more suffering for ourselves. So rather than doing that, because these negative things in our lives are going to happen anyway, there's no point in actually trying really hard to avoid them, because even if we try to avoid them, they're just going to happen anyway, and in trying to avoid them, we're creating more agitation for ourselves. So this is one part of developing compassion, is just looking at the First Noble Truth, being able to look at suffering directly. And a story that I like to tell, and it's a monk in a different tradition, but it's a tradition which has a lot of similarities to our tradition, the Chinese Chan tradition. And the previous abbot of the founder of City of 10,000 Buddhas, Master Xuanhua, his teacher, Master Shu Yu, an empty cloud, who many people here have probably heard of or read about. There's an experience that he had in his life, which for me embodies the ultimate act of compassion, or the practice of compassion, because compassion isn't just a mental state that we cultivate in the meditation, but it comes out in our actions. It's similar to metta in that the commentaries talk about having metta, spreading metta to yourself and spreading metta to others. But really, if we have metta for ourselves, it naturally radiates out to others. It's not something we need to consciously spread necessarily. So with compassion, it can kind of be the same. If we're able to see suffering, then we're actually able to start to care more, start to have more empathy, start to have more of a sense of wanting to see others do well, wanting them to be free of a very genuine wish for others to be free of suffering. So the very definition of compassion is wanting others to not just to be free of suffering, but acknowledging that they need to stop doing the causes of their suffering in order to be free of suffering. And also, before I get to this story about Shu Yun, in the Four Noble Truths, it's very interesting to note that the Four Noble Truths are impersonal. It's not So the Four Noble Truths are suffering, the cause of suffering, the end of suffering, the path leading to the end of suffering. It's not my suffering, the cause of my suffering, the end of my suffering, the path leading to the ending of my suffering. It doesn't say that. It just says suffering. So it's just suffering everywhere. We don't just see it in ourselves, but we see it everywhere. The cause of suffering, we don't just see it in ourselves, but we see it everywhere. The end of suffering, we don't just see it in ourselves, and we don't really see it everywhere, but we want to see it everywhere. And then the path leading to the ending of suffering, we can develop that for ourselves, and anybody else can develop it to a greater or lesser extent as well. So that's all. The Four Noble Truths are very impersonal and all-encompassing. It's not just pertaining to us. It's pertaining to ourselves and others. It's pertaining to everywhere that suffering is arising, everywhere that the cause is happening, everywhere where there's a cessation of suffering, and everywhere where the path is being practiced. So Master Shu Yun, as some people might know, he lived to be 120 years old, and he passed away in 1959. And he was the head of 5 schools of Buddhism in China. And he was considered one of the greatest monks over the past 1,000 years, one of the greatest monks in the world. And when he passed away finally, he was 120. So he lived in China and was from the south, I believe, in South China. And he was famous. Part of his biography is that he's a great Tudong monk. He practiced wandering all over China. And when he was about 40 years old, and he had been a monk for about 20 years, he decided that, and his mother had died giving birth to him, so he never really knew his mother at all, and was raised by his father and relatives. And so he thought at 20 vasas, when he was about 40 years old, a little over 40 years old, he decided he would do 3 steps, 1 bow across China to repay the kindness of his mother, dedicate the merit, dedicate the goodness to his mother. And so he did that. It took him 5 years, I think over 5 years, and he almost died a couple of times, came very close to dying a couple of times. But anyway, I'm not going to go into the details of that story. You should read his biography and you'll get that story. But I want to tell a different story much later in his life. And the story is that, which is illustrative of what I consider to be one of the highest levels of compassion, which is he had been a great teacher for many years already, and he was about a little over 100 years old at that point. And this was the start of the Cultural Revolution in China. And what was happening was everything was falling apart. Military didn't get paid, so they had a lot of them had become mercenaries and roaming bandits, and were pillaging and ransacking villages, and also were very against Buddhism, so they were going around destroying monasteries, killing all the monks. That was happening at that time. So they went to Master Shu Yun's monastery, and of course he's considered like one of the greatest monks in China, so of course they want to go there and get rid of him. And so they went, and all of the other monks hid, and Master Shu Yun, being over 100, he just stayed where he was, and they actually attacked him, and they beat him really severely with like bats and clubs, and for quite a while actually, and he was just kind of in a heap on the ground, and they thought he was dead. And I think he was 103 or 104 at that point, and they thought he was dead. They left, and his students came out, and they were like, they went up to him, and they were trying to see what they could do, and they one of them put his head up to his face and could see that there was like bubbles still, like he was breathing. And so there was like bubbles of like blood and stuff still like coming out of his nose, and he was breathing, and they could see he was still alive. So they whispered, they said, Master, Master, like, you don't have to stay alive for us. Because they could see he was in a lot of pain as well. You don't have to stay alive for us. You've passed on your teachings well, and this is, don't feel like you have to, struggle to live just for our sake. And then he kind of turned a little bit at that moment and said, it's not for you, it's for them that I stay alive. And so for me, that just makes my hair stand on end. Every time I tell that story, it's really powerful. And then he recovered. And after that, he was blind and deaf, but still continued to teach. And he recovered from that. And then somehow word got to these bandits that he had recovered. And they went and they were so amazed that I don't know if it was one of them or the whole group actually became his students after that. And they actually asked forgiveness and became his students. But if he would have allowed himself to die at that time, then they would have had some of the worst possible karma they could have made for killing a noble being. But because of his compassion, then he was actually able to will himself to live, even though he was so old already. And then, of course, he lived to be 120, which is totally amazing. So I think in terms of a recollection, that's something which is really worth keeping in mind, that the ultimate level of compassion is something that even if somebody did the worst possible things they could do to us, then still we wouldn't hold it against them. We wouldn't want to see that person suffer. We wouldn't want to see something bad happen to them. So this is, it's very, very powerful. And that must have been incredibly difficult to do, but for him, because he'd been practicing compassion his whole life and recollecting compassion his whole life, for us, are we able to have compassion for the person who rolled their eyes at us, or the person who, kind of talked bad about us behind our back? And usually the answer is no, let alone somebody who beats us nearly to death with clubs. That's a whole nother level. So if and when these things do happen to us, to not fear them or to try to avoid situations like this, because we don't know what's going to happen in our lives, what is going to happen to us over however long we're alive in this very short lifespan that we have. We don't know what's going to happen, if we're going to be caught in a flood or a fire or some sort of storm or attacked by somebody. We don't know what's going to happen. So, or what it's going to be like if we're going to get some sort of disease. So I mentioned earlier that whenever I think about compassion, my practice seems to get more difficult, but it's because we're facing suffering. So it's difficult, but it's good difficulty. It's the difficulty that leads to the end of difficulty, suffering that leads to the ending of suffering. So when we recollect these things, when we courageously have compassion, then we're actually looking at suffering. We're practicing the Four Noble Truths in a very real and a very practical and applied way. So this is very important to remember, very important to recollect quite often. It's a Brahma Vihara, so it's a very divine state. It's something that's not that ordinary or normal among human beings, but it is a Brahma state, a divine state, and very bright state, a very wholesome state. It's not that we're getting upset about the suffering in the world, but we're actually doing something about it with ourselves. We're working on ourselves. And so suffering, whether it's our own suffering coming to an end or suffering out in the world, suffering of other people coming to an end. It doesn't come to an end through getting upset. It doesn't come to an end through getting irritated. It doesn't come to an end, certainly it doesn't come to an end through cruelty and through killing all the bad people. If we kill all the bad people, then we're the bad people. So what we want is an end to killing. So you don't achieve that through killing. You achieve that through refraining from all types of cruelty, both internal and external. So that's the way to actually end suffering. And that's impersonal, not just end our suffering, but just to end suffering in general, to end suffering as an abstraction, as something universal. So to depersonalize the Four Noble Truths in this way, I believe is very, very important and absolutely necessary to get a deeper understanding of what the Buddha was teaching. If we keep relating to the Four Noble Truths in a personal way, then I don't think we've understood. I don't think we've understood yet, because it's not about my suffering or your suffering. It's just about suffering in a very impersonal way. So that's important for us to think about. When we depersonalize it like that, I think we'll be able to be more courageous, be more compassionate, and we'll be able to face whatever life throws at us. So whatever it is, if we get cancer, I think it's like 1 in 3 people now is going to get cancer. So when we think about compassion, we start talking about all these negative things, sickness, death, and yet these are the things that are going to happen. So we need to be able to face them. We need to be ready for them. It's not just that we want to only look at the good things and the beautiful things in life and just surround ourselves with those and try to push away the truths of aging, sickness, death, harshness in the world, people mistreating each other. We don't want to surround ourselves with things that'll keep us from seeing all of those negative things. And compassion gives us the courage to look at all the negativity and to have some empathy for it and to fully acknowledge it, that this is just a normal part of having a human existence. And ultimately, it's leading us towards the Dhamma. So earlier also, I mentioned some differences between the world and the Dhamma, that a lot of times we might get stressed out because we take on too much. We feel like we want to achieve a lot and we want to do a lot of things. We want to take on many things. And there's that sense of achievement through doing many, many things. And that achievement in the Dhamma is the opposite of achievement in the world. So achievement in the Dhamma takes place when we drop things and when we let go of things, not when we gain things and complete things. It actually comes when we drop things and let go of things. And so actually asking ourselves, how much can I drop? How much can I let go of? What is possible? And there's the famous quote of Luang Por Chah, which probably everybody here knows, that if you let go a little, you get a little peace. If you let go a lot, you get a lot of peace. If you let go completely, you get complete peace. So Luang Por Chah was just a master of illustrating these things in a very real and applied way. So it's good to recollect great teachers. It's good to recollect people like great bhikkhus like Master Shu Yun. It's good to recollect Ajahn Chah, who taught. Ajahn Chah was known to teach all day and sometimes all night under his kuti, just receiving people under his kuti and receiving each person as an individual, receiving them and speaking with them, and they would tell him about their problems and their difficulties, and he would reflect on Dhamma for them or talk to them in some way for a shorter or longer period of time. And he would be sometimes known to be under his kuti receiving people from after the mealtime, which they only have 1 meal a day there, so would be 9 or 10 a.m. all through the day, and then all through the night until 2 or 3 a.m., and then go to morning chanting. And so people would wait and line up to get that advice from Luang Por Chah, but he exerted himself so hard. He must have physically suffered immensely to be able to teach so many people and have so much compassion for so many people and just help them so much. And there's kind of a funny story of, I just read a really good book, highly recommended for anybody who comes across it, The Chithurst Story by George Sharp. Really good book, and talks about Luang Por Sumedho going to England and how George Sharp, previous to that, had gone to Ajahn Mahabua's monastery and Ajahn Chah's monastery and was trying to invite their Western students to come to England and start up a monastery and ultimately start Buddhism in England. And going to Ajahn Chah and just really connecting with him and being really, really impressed and amazed how happy this person was, how happy this monk was, and how he could be stern, but at the same time it was all out of compassion. He didn't have a care in the world for himself, and how he could just so natural, so happy, and he was totally amazed by this. And eventually George Sharp went back for another visit, and his daughter visited, and then his daughter didn't have faith in Buddhism. I believe she was Christian, but she went anyway, and she enjoyed being around Ajahn Chah, but she wouldn't bow and she wouldn't put her hands in Anjali. And so when she went to ask Ajahn Chah, or talk with Ajahn Chah, she never bowed or never put her hands in Anjali, but Ajahn Chah still received her and talked to her and answered questions through a translator. And I don't know exactly what questions she was asking him, but then George Sharp felt horrified that she wasn't bowing to this great master and not even putting her hands in Anjali when she was speaking. And he went to Ajahn Chah to apologize, and Ajahn Chah said, "Oh, she's got a good heart. It doesn't matter. Those are just the external forms." He's like, "You wouldn't believe how many stupid people I receive in a day." She's actually smart and asking me good questions that are meaningful. So I really appreciated her. So anyway, he said she's like a whetstone to hone my wisdom on. He didn't necessarily want people just to, be ultra respectful towards him. He wanted questions of substance. He wanted people to talk with him about things that were meaningful. And he said, "Oh yeah, she's talking about things of substance, things that are meaningful." And so that's what was important to Luang Por Chah, just being genuine. And we don't necessarily need those gestures of respect in order to be genuine. Of course, he did devise a plan to get her to bow to him, and that was as she was leaving, he came up and gave her a bunch of roses, and then she bowed to him. So, and then Luang Por Chah looked with a wry glance at George Sharp, and see, pretty good, huh? So, yeah. Anyway, he was very compassionate as well, and also I was mentioning earlier that about 20 years ago, when Tanaja Mahabua went to Wat Pah Nanachat to visit, and they had a Q&A session with him, and a junior monk asking, "Well, what's the mind of an arhat like?" And then him saying, "There's only compassion." Right away, that was his answer. There's only compassion. So we do. The arhats get a bad rap in Mahayana Buddhism, but I think the way they describe their version of Srimatra is more, their version of arhat is more like our version of Srimatra. And so we can say for sure, there's no doubt that for an arhat, there's no selfishness left. There's only compassion, and they do act on that compassion and overextend themselves. I think Ajahn Chah probably overextended himself to the point that he lessened his lifespan. He just literally worked himself almost to death just to help other people. And really it seems to be, that's what he cared about, was ending suffering in a very impersonal way. I'll leave that. That's probably enough for a talk before we go back to our meditation. Did you want to do the closing chant? Yeah. If somebody else knows it, they could. Yeah. So we'll continue sitting for about 25 minutes, and after that we'll transition to walking meditation. And I think if anybody needs a bio break, then it could do it during the walking meditation periods. we'll transition to doing a period of walking meditation because there's more people here in person this afternoon, and also probably a few new people on the Zoom and YouTube. So I will walk back and forth in the Dhamma hall here again, and I can give instruction for the next 30 minutes on that. And otherwise, people are welcome to find their own places for doing walking meditation. But you can stick around if you want some instruction in walking meditation. We'll come back together at 2:30. I'll ring the bell at that time. So normally we walk a little bit slower than we would walk in our daily life. To find something about between 20 and 30 paces. I usually do 23, 24, 25 paces. And cultivating mindfulness with every step. And we can check in with ourselves at one end of the path. Has our mind wandered? And then in the middle of the path, checking in. Has the mind wandered, or are we still with the body, still with the breath, still with Bhutto? And if not, we stop, reestablish Bhut with the right, toe with the left, mentally reciting Bhutto. And if walking fast helps you to become more peaceful, then you can try walking fast. Or if walking very slow is more helpful for you, you can try that. And sometimes something I like to do if it's after the meal, like now, taking deep breaths from time to time during the walking meditation, and help to wake the mind up, help to give rise to some bodily energy to prepare ourselves for more sitting afterwards. And something we could do during walk meditation, which is mindfulness of the body, and we can feel where there might be any tension in the body and relaxing that tension in the legs, in the stomach, in the face, chest, and breathing in a very natural way. Keeping the mind light, simple, unburdened, unencumbered, at ease, in a very normal state. I don't need to do anything that special or get into some super deep meditative state, but just allowing ourselves to be at ease in a very normal state. The Buddha called this the straight mind. And then not looking down in terms of bending the neck forward, but eyes are downcast, looking a plow's length in front of us, which is about 9 feet. Okay, so we'll have a Q&A session. Just wait for a couple minutes. We don't really have any questions, so if anybody has any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. Otherwise, I'll start asking live questions from the live audience here. The only questions are, good afternoon, Ajahn. Just curious to know if the meal blessing chant can be found in either volume of the chanting book. Thank you. Yes, that's page 50 of chanting book 1. It's called Just as Rivers, and it's in the Pali and English translated. We chant it from time to time during puja. One person said, volume is low. I think that's probably fixed now. That was at 1 p.m. Please turn the entry and exit chime off. Okay, already done. So I had that on at first just because I had the waiting room on and it was hard to see when somebody was coming in. So I turned the chime on so I would know. But I turned it off now. What is the name of the Chinese monk you spoke about, please? So that's Master Shu Yun, also known as Empty Cloud. So his name is normally spelled HSU space YUN, and that's translated as Empty Cloud. That wasn't his original name. He had a different original name. If anybody here knows it, feel free to call out what Shu Yun's original name, or if you know your own original name, you can call that out as well. And thank you. He changed his name at a certain point in order to be more anonymous. He was always seeking solitude. And so even though he was the head of 5 lineages of 5 schools of Buddhism in China, he always wanted to get away and meditate. So he was always wanting to be in solitude. So he changed his name to be more anonymous. But then, of course, that name is the one that became famous. So you can't, if you're really compassionate, you can't remain anonymous for long. Can you speak more about the relationship between karuna and upekkha and skillfully developing that? Okay. Well, all the Brahmaviharas up to upekkha have to be tempered by upekkha, tempered by equanimity. That's very important. And that's in the suttas. The Buddha speaks of that. Because for karuna, if it's not tempered by upekkha, we might get too lost in stress or suffering because of somebody else's suffering. So we might get too lost in it and not be able to, if we aren't able to be in a state of peace and ease and well-being ourselves, then there's not much we can do to help. But if we're actually not completely lost or stuck in the type of stress that other people might be stuck in, then maybe we can actually do something. We might be in a good position to help. So upekkha, the development of upekkha is described as a reflection on kamma. So to develop upekkha, to develop equanimity, you're actually supposed to reflect on kamma. I am the owner of my actions, heir to my actions, born of my actions, related to my actions, abide supported by my actions, actions being kamma. Whatever kamma I will do for good or for ill, of that I will be the heir. And then the next part is all beings are the owners of their kamma, heir to their kamma, born of their kamma, related to their kamma, and abide supported by their kamma. Whatever kamma they will do for good or for ill, of that they will be the heir. So everybody is the recipient of their good and bad actions. And these are the things that we're born from, actually, that give rise to whatever life we have in this lifetime. And the reflection on kamma gives rise to upekkha, because we recognize that much of the time there's not much we can do. There's not actually much we can do. So we develop those good intentions of karuna, of compassion, of the wish for others to be free of suffering, but then we can't take other people's kamma away from them. And also we can't go back and change our own past. So there's actually a lovely phrase in the suttas where the Buddha talks about difficulties that can happen to a practitioner, and more precisely to a monk, but it can be any practitioner, that we come up against karmic obstacles. So some sort of obstacle that we come up against that we can't get over. So everybody has this. Everybody who comes to the practice comes into it with all of their karmic baggage, and this is what we have to work with. And even if we're the most sincere practitioner possible and we're very desirous of training, eventually we're going to reach a point where we come up against our own karmic obstacles. And so the Buddha said, when you get to that point, then you actually develop equanimity. You just stay at that edge and develop equanimity and reflect that I am the owner of my actions. Can't go back and change the past. And then he says, and a bhikkhu reflects thus, what can be done? The kamma is strong. Nothing can be done at this time. So we use upekkha both towards ourselves and then towards others if we might want to help somebody. And we may have people who have a lot of empathy, people in this room, or people who are watching this virtually may have had the experience at some point in your life of actually trying to help somebody and not being able to help them. Or they weren't receptive to the help, like you genuinely want to help them, you genuinely want to see them get better, and then they weren't receptive to that help, or you genuinely go out of your way to try to do everything you can to help someone in the best way possible with the best intentions, and they end up not being able to be helped, not being receptive to that, and that's when you reflect on kamma and come back to equanimity, like, okay, well, it looks like nothing can be done at this time, so we come back to our own center and we come back to looking after ourselves rather than overextending ourselves to try to maybe help somebody else to stop some bad habits, or we see that somebody else is running with the wrong crowd and we try to get them to stop that, and no matter what we do, then they won't. So this is kamma. So we do have to reflect on upekkha in order to come back to our own center and not get too stressed about other people's stress. In what ways are a stream enter like a Mahayana depiction of an arhat? I guess it depends on which Mahayana person you talk to. But I did mention that earlier. Not just like, this is like, when I speak, it's not like super laser exact, precise ways of speaking, but this is more of a general way of speaking because in some ways, like when they describe the arhat as being very, very selfish and just attaining liberation for themselves and not caring about anybody else. And so I've read this in the Tibetan teachings, and I do think it's a historical misunderstanding that has happened because it doesn't at all match what the suttas say, but this is widely taught in, say, the Tibetan tradition and maybe assumed in the Chan Mahayana tradition, but not as widely taught or spoken about, that, it's a selfish form of enlightenment if you don't want to attain Buddhahood. However, so a stream enter perhaps still has some selfishness, but they've let go of a ton of suffering. So in one Tibetan text that I keep coming back to because I love it, and I won't name it because I don't want to speak ill of it because I really do like it, but there is this part that I disagree with where the Arhat is described as, well, they haven't actually completed the path. They've only gone part way, and they actually haven't attained full enlightenment. And so that does match what I see as the description of the stream enterer, like they're just at the beginning of the noble path. And so yeah, I definitely disagree with that. And the Arhat, the Buddha in the Pali Canon, the Buddha talks about Arhants as having the same liberation as him, exactly the same liberation, no different. And yet, what we call wasana, the character, the abilities are different. So the Buddha has the full range of, say, psychic powers, and the full range of abilities to know others' proclivities and what's the best teaching for any person at any given time. Not all Arhants are going to have those types of abilities. However, the liberation is the same. Liberation is exactly the same. And so, in a lot of Mahayana texts, it'll be like, well, the Arhat hasn't become a Buddha. So, of course, that's true according to the Pali Canon, too. There was the Bodhisatta who spent however many aeons. Each Bodhisatta is going to be different in terms of the number of aeons they have to practice to achieve Buddhahood and have their own Buddhasasana. Yes, there is that. And yet, in the Pali Canon, there's actually one place where the Buddha refers to his Arhat disciples as Tathagatas, which is an epithet for the Buddha. So he says these Tathagatas are done with birth and death. So the Arhat is very much, the Buddha holds them up as almost equal to himself, and certainly equal to himself in liberation. So that's definitely a different understanding. So I'll leave that at that. Okay, now there's a lot of questions. There's a question I almost skipped, but I thought I didn't want to make this person upset. How to work with anger. And I'm just going to answer that one very short. I tend to not give long answers to these very general things, but you don't work with anger, you work against anger. So you don't actually want to keep it. It's good to let go of it. And this comes back to mindfulness. Actually, something like anger, there is a technique, and I've used it myself and recommended it to others and heard that it's been helpful for people, is that if you get angry and you're going to speak out of anger, then actually take a deep breath before you speak, and just take one deep breath, and then that can really help to come from more of a wise place. And anger is also the second of the 5 hindrances, and the Buddha said it weakens our wisdom. So acknowledging that, doing these reflections, that anger actually doesn't help us, it actually weakens our wisdom and discernment. And we can do that reflection as well. And when we have mindfulness, when we establish mindfulness, the mindfulness and the anger can't actually coexist. It's one or the other. So an unwholesome mental state of anger can't coexist with a wholesome mental state. So mindfulness can actually bring it to a neutral state. When we establish mindfulness, when we think we're knowing anger, or we think we're mindful of anger, that's not actually mindfulness. We're subtly doing something to keep it going. We're planting little seeds to keep it generated. And I used to disagree with that teaching, but this teaching that Ajahn Sona gave me when I was asking him about something similar, and he said, well, you can't. I said, I'm mindful of it. And he said, no, if you had mindfulness, it wouldn't be there. Once you establish mindfulness, it's like flipping your hand around. It's either you have the mindfulness or you have the anger. The anger can't really coexist with real mindfulness. And so when you establish the mindfulness, there will be that brief moment where you see the suffering of it, but then it can flip over. And usually what we're doing when we think we're being mindful of something like anger is we're actually continuing to put little thoughts into it, like those kind of, we're personalizing it, we're planting like, well, this feeling is so strong and they did this to me, and we're planting those little thoughts, and we're continuing to do that. And in planting those thoughts, we might think we're being mindful of it. Like, I know I'm angry, I know this isn't good, but this did this, and there's this reason and that reason, and it's a really strong feeling. And so if we were actually mindful of it, we would bring it back to the body and actually just depersonalize it and stop putting those thoughts into it that are keeping it going. So mindfulness of the body, putting in a plug for mindfulness of the body, and seeing what's becoming tight in the body, consciously calming that's a technique for working with it. So grateful for your teaching today. I've been practicing with Ajahn Achalo's guided compassion meditations that have been profoundly helpful. Do you have additional suggestions for direct practice of compassion for self or others during meditation? I think pretty much covered it. Certainly Ajahn Achalo's compassion meditations are excellent. And because he actually he couples it with, it's similar to what I was talking about during the Dhamma talk, is that he really does couple it with death contemplation. And I think he has different death contemplations, where one is a loved one dying, another one is the contemplation of dying of cancer, imagining yourself dying of cancer. And the compassion meditations are actually coupled with those as well. And so developing compassion for oneself, I think it dovetails well with that teaching on courage in terms of courageously looking at suffering. So a lot of times when we do metta practice, it's not really necessarily where we're looking directly at birth, aging, sickness, and death. Or we might be looking at birth, but not aging, sickness, and death. Whereas compassion, it ends up that all these things end up coming up because that's what we're compassionate towards. So when we age, that's a form of suffering. When we die, that's a form of suffering. When we get sick, that's a form of suffering. And so developing compassion for ourselves means practicing in a way that we can prepare the mind so that we're ready when these things inevitably happen to us, and that we see the suffering of them. And so we let go of that, trying to make it different, trying to make it otherwise. So the entire practice in that sense is combined with compassion, because we're being very compassionate to ourselves just to remind ourselves of these things on a daily basis as practitioners. And for others, others are our teachers, so we can actually see it everywhere. Younger people are growing older people are growing even older, and people are getting sick. Everybody gets sick. Healthy people who were healthy last week are sick this week, and so on. People who didn't have cancer before then develop cancer. It's like one of the monks who was a monk for over 10 years in Thailand, an Australian monk, Tanio, just developing a really aggressive cancer in his left lung, and he's only probably a year or two older than me, maybe a little bit more than that. And he had to have his entire left lung removed. And we don't know how much time that's going to buy him, but he had a tumor that was bigger than his lung, actually, that came out of the lung. And so it was pretty amazing, pretty horrific. And that can happen. That can just happen to any of us. We don't know. So it's very compassionate just to remind ourselves of these things, that these things can happen anytime. It's a good one. How do we develop or cultivate more compassion or care towards people like family members in our life for whom we feel anger or resentment? Yeah, that's an interesting one, because that's always, who ends up being the most difficult, the people the closest to us, family, friends, the people we live with. And it's only those people we're close with who we might feel betrayed, or that we end up making some sort of mistake towards them, or doing something unskillful towards them, or they do something unskillful towards us, which is just natural because they're the ones that we're around the most. So people doing bad things in the world, it's very remote. We're not always directly connected with them, like the things we see on the news, for example. But our friends and family, we're connected with them all the time, and so they might end up doing things that might frustrate, irritate us, or genuinely might be the victims of abuse in a very real way. And this is exactly like the last question. So just coming back to the banes of samsara, the suffering of it all, and reflecting on suffering. And it's not necessarily the case that we just gloss everything over and forgive them and forget what they've done to us if family members have maybe mistreated us in some way. But what we do is we can actually reflect that one of the drawbacks of samsara is that there's never going to be somebody who sees completely eye to eye with us, even our best friend. There's always going to be some difference, even if it's not spoken about. There's always going to be some difference in opinion, some difference in the way we feel about things. And that's one of the defects of samsara. So when we reflect like that, it gives rise to a quality known as nibbida, or world weariness, where we actually think, okay, well, this is just how it is. This is the seha world, the world of suffering. And this is just how it is. No matter how much tension or stress there is, then these relationships are never going to be perfect. And human relationships are always going to be messy. They're never going to meet the ideal. And even if they seem to meet the ideal, there'll always be something that's not 100% ideal about it. And so this is what the Buddha's talking about when he talks about suffering, when he talks about dukkha. This is dukkha. Being separated from the loved is dukkha. Being associated with that which we don't like is dukkha. In brief, the 5 khandhas are dukkha. So, and even getting what we want is dukkha, because it doesn't last. It changes. And even happiness is dukkha. Happiness is suffering. It's the suffering of change, because once we lose it, it changes into something unpleasant. So this is always changing. Also, the reflection on kamma to develop equanimity can be helpful for this, especially for dealing with family members. And also courageous kindness. Kindness in the face of all odds, in all adversity, can be helpful with family members we might feel irritated with, just no matter how they get us, no matter how they criticize us. Remember Lumpur Pasano saying, I remember telling it, like, oh, parents can really push our buttons, can't they? And he said, it's not just that they can push our buttons, it's that they put them there. So just acknowledging that as well. Or if you're a parent, your kids put buttons there and they push them. So courageous kindness in the face of all odds, we can remember that can be something which buoys up our practice. A practical question. I would like to attend the katina, but duties here keep me from traveling. Will it be broadcast over Zoom or YouTube? Not sure yet, but we'll let you know via our website. All religions acknowledge a movement toward the good as the good of this life, including Buddhism. What is the creator of this tendency, this movement, this inclination? toward the good as the ideal tendency for this life? Why does this tendency / movement exist? That's the mystery. It'll always be a mystery why people are attracted towards goodness. It's not that all people move towards goodness, though. Some people are moving in the other direction. But good people of all religions do move towards goodness, and I have a lot of respect for Christianity. I've met Christians who I'm very impressed with, and like our neighbors, the Mount Tabor Monastery. We have a Christian monastery next door of forest monks, and I've always been very impressed with them. And I've met Christians while traveling. I've talked to Christians, and I've been very impressed with many of the Christians I've met, because I think it really, there's a lot of ideas in many religions. There's a lot of ideas that are universal, and trying to think, one of them is not just things like generosity, looking after parents, these gratitude to parents, these things seem to be somewhat universal, but also holding something higher up than ourselves is something that seems to be why people who uphold a religion have a certain dignity, will have a certain dignity or a certain way of holding themselves, because the Buddha reflected on this after his enlightenment, and he reflected that for one who doesn't hold what in this world can I bow to now that I've attained something that no other human being yet to date has attained? What can I bow to? Because in him there was still that inclination to bow to something. And he said, well, because there's no human I could bow to, because I would have to only bow to a human who's more developed than myself, and there is none. And in terms of virtue, samadhi, and wisdom, there's no other human who's more developed than the Buddha. And so he said, well, I'm going to bow to the Dhamma. I will bow to the Dhamma that I've realized and hold that up as my principle that I always hold up over my head and always bow to and always take as my guidepost, as my bastion, so to speak, as my standard. And so that's very beautiful, because he reflects that for people, he says, for people, if they don't bow to anything, if they don't hold anything higher than themselves, for them there is no happiness. For them there is no true happiness. So for Christians, if you hold Jesus or God above yourself all the time, then that gives you a sense of dignity. That'll give you a sense of purpose, a sense of drive, a fire for virtue, and so on for other religions as well. So it's really a principle of holding something higher than ourselves. And yes, that is when we hold something higher than ourselves. If what we're holding higher than ourselves is something wholesome and not something really awful, then of course it's natural that anybody in any religion is going to move towards the good. But in terms of why this exists, I don't know. Yeah, I know there is a Tibetan Rinpoche who said one time that conscious awareness, is the most mysterious thing in the universe. So it's just something we can't really talk about or explain. Hey Ajahn, are the 4 Brahmaviharas 4 different mental states, or is it more like one state / emotion with 4 aspects? Similarly, with respect to practice, is it 4 different practices to develop the Brahmaviharas? Yeah, I am not incredibly skilled or advanced in these things, but I do think they're different states, because one way I've heard it explained, and I really don't like using the word jhana or talking about jhanas, but just for the sake of an academic discussion, I'm going to use the word jhana. because Luang Por tended to not use that word. He tended to just say, make the mind peaceful. But that you could say that metta is connected to the first jhana, karuna is connected to the second, mudita is the third, and upekkha is the fourth. And you do see correlations there. So that metta, if it's translated as goodwill, Bhante Gunaratana talks about this as well, of metta jhana, and I believe that would be connected with the first jhana, and then karuna is more of a profound, or maybe you could say a quieter state, and mudita, rejoicing. And then upekkha, the Buddha describes in the Noble Eightfold Path teaching that the fourth jhana being without somanasa and domanasa, so without delight or sadness, without happiness and suffering, mindfulness purified by equanimity. So that idea of equanimity comes up. So I think they're all related, they're all good. So they're all good, but they can be different reflections, different contemplations. They are different states because they're for the removal of different things. Venerable Sariputta talks about the four Brahmaviharas for being able to remove different things. Metta, goodwill, is for the removal of hostility, or for the removal of ill will. Karuna, compassion, is for the removal of thoughts of cruelty. Mudita, the third one, rejoicing, is for removal of resentment. Upekkha is for removal of lust, interestingly. So they're for removing different things, and yet they are all considered paths to to liberations, temporary liberations of mind. And the jhanas are also called temporary liberations of mind. And so that's why they're linked. So they are different, but they're related. They're all good. They're all very good. They're all very wholesome. They're all states. Also, one way that they're related is all four Brahmaviharas are outside of the desire realm. So all four Brahmaviharas are completely outside of the realm of sensuality, even metta. So in terms of the mind being fully in that state, they're not part of the desire realm. In our human existence, this is the desire realm. But those Brahmaviharas temporarily transcend human existence, and it's above the sensual realm. That's it for online questions. Any in-person questions? We have time for a couple more. Yeah.
Just my own reflection on self-compassion. I'm finding that as I have aged and am a couple of weeks away from 81 years old and have lost some energy and some physicality, that I can see the wisdom in the letting go. And yet I have some identity around some of the things that I'm pursuing that no longer come as easily to me as they have in the past. And it all seems to be coming up with a lot of sadness. And particularly if I've noticed, if I'm identified with whatever it is that I'm loosening hold of. And so I just wondered if you had any thoughts about that, or I'm just bringing awareness to that sadness that's coming up, and that's how I'm dealing with it.
Very good question. Well, you're in that state, and I'm not, so I'm not as old as you. But yeah, it is sad. It's sad to grow older. I even think about growing older, and I look at photos from myself when I was in Anagarika at Abhayagiri, and I don't have that same kind of like glow. And so So yeah, aging happens, and it just keeps going, and it only goes in one direction, and there is a sadness to it, and that's the dukkha of aging. So the sadness you're experiencing is the dukkha. So like just saying this is suffering, and then that naturally gives rise to compassion for yourself, because there's this natural thing, this natural phenomenon that's happening. The body is in decline, and my mind isn't going to work as well. As the older I get, my mind is going to decline as well, and I can't hold on to these things. And this is what the Buddha was teaching all along, that the body and mind is constantly in decline. And it's been this way since time immemorial, and it always will be this way. These are the universal truths the Buddha's talking about. So really looking towards death, preparing the mind for death is very important. And we all have to do that, even those of us who aren't old, because we don't know when death will come. But those reflections that when we see that, yeah, the Buddha talked about old age as suffering. He didn't say like, oh, it's really great, 80, 90 years old, it's just going to get better and better. He didn't say that. He said, no, this is suffering. Whereas you do hear that sometimes, like, oh, it's just going to get better, But actually, that's what I love about the Buddha. It's like, no, it's not going to get better. Actually, it's going to be painful, and the body is going to fall apart. And then he talked about himself, that he felt like a cart that was strapped together, and that it was just held together, just barely held together. And so this is, that I think those types of reflections naturally give rise to a sense of a brightening of the mind, or where is our true refuge? Because if we take refuge in the body or in the mind, in having these faculties, these are the khandhas, these actually belong to Mara, these belong to the elements, so it's not something that we can take refuge in. So it's actually causing the mind to look for a true refuge. And then the Buddha teaching that the true refuge is mindfulness and awareness, and ultimately the purified awareness, which getting in touch with that's like provisions for the journey. So I would see old age also as getting ready for a journey, getting ready for the next step, for death, but also death and birth. We call it, no, we don't just say rebirth, but we also say re-death, like acknowledging you've most likely, according to the Buddha's teachings, we've all been through this many, many, many times, through this death process. But there's a switch in the mind, because it's normally too traumatic to remember. So there's a switch in the mind where we can't remember it for most of us unless we develop those abilities through meditation. So just how skillfully do we relate to it? But those qualities we build up through a lifetime of practice are really going to help. When I think of Ruth, who Ruth Dennison is, yeah. Ruth Dennison. She had Alzheimer's leading up to her death, and she had developed mindfulness to such an extent that she could tell people when it was coming on, and she could say, soon I'm going to start acting strange, don't pay attention to me. It's just the brain, it's just a matter of the khandhas. And then she would go into the state of just dementia. And yet she was mindful enough and she didn't take it personally. She wasn't attached to it. So she was actually able to tell people, like, this is just nature. And Luang Por Chah was the same. He had a degenerative brain condition. And before he was completely paralyzed and before he lost his ability to speak, he would go into these dementia fits. And he would actually tell the monks, this thing is going to happen from time to time, don't pay attention to me. And he got into these states where he'd wake up in the middle of the night screaming for his dentures and crying. And the monks would be totally flabbergasted, and they'd be crying because they didn't know what was happening. But Luang Por Chah, when he then came out of the state, said, don't pay attention to me when I'm in that state. That's just a matter of the brain. And it's just, there's no when that state occurs, there's no control. But he was mindful and he knew what was happening, like when he was going to go into that state. But then after that, he became completely paralyzed. So when we practice for a long time, then we build up those wholesome qualities to that point where that's why we have to practice a lot, 'cause make it second nature. Do you have any teachings for us about aging?
Patience and persistence.
Compassion. One more question, Fred.
It's about self-compassion too. Oh, microphone's on. Is it on? Hello. It's about self-compassion and just like having needs like self-kindness and self-care and maybe need to belong or some need for warmth. So how does that relate to also wanting to let go? And, ideally I wouldn't need warmth or any special care, but I think most of my life I have been erring on the not caring for myself as much as I could. So there seems to be a little bit of tension there and some exploration. But I wonder if you could talk to self-compassion and the relationship to needs and so on.
Yeah, I don't know if I can say much more than what I've already said about it. That one is the reflection on suffering can naturally give rise to a sense of compassion for oneself. And also the acknowledgement that the more we practice, the less we run up against the suffering. So letting go is the most compassionate thing we can do for ourselves. So actually seeing where are we running up against dissatisfaction, and are we actually able to let go of that? If we're still stuck on certain things and we're not able to let go of them, because maybe we've never let go of it before and we don't really know what the experience of letting go of it is like. So therefore there might be we might be hesitating to let go. So that's why I say compassion is coupled with courage, because it's like taking a leap of faith that you actually have to let go of the things that might be troubling you. And once you are able to let go of them, then you'll have that new experience that you haven't experienced before. So that's and that's very compassionate towards oneself, because then those things might just fall away, and it might not be a problem anymore. But there's that hesitancy because this is the known. We don't want to go into the unknown. We want to stay with the known, even though it's suffering. So even though it is suffering and we don't like suffering, but it is what we know. So even though we don't like it, at least we know it's there for us. Like a friend that we were always trying to get away from, but we also can't stop hanging out with. So it's just there, and we haven't really had that experience of just walking away. That's what the monks do. That's why it's called going forth. And you don't really know, when you go forth as a monk, you don't really know what the experience is going to be like. But you kind of see it at a distance, and you know that, that looks kind of good or interesting, but I don't know if I could do that myself, But then the people who end up becoming monks, there's a certain type of faith that gets kindled, and So this is talked about in Thailand, this Saddha Karawat, Saddha Prat, which is like different types of faith. So the faith of the lay people is like, well, we can't do that yet, so we're going to practice generosity, and we're going to help out because we're rooting for you guys. But then there's a higher faith that's needed to actually be like, no, I'm going to become one of you guys. Like, I'm going to actually go forth and do that. So the next step you're talking about is like, that's the part of your mind that's the monk part of your mind that wants that maybe something that Ajahn Chah had, the great happiness that we see Ajahn Chah or the Dalai Lama or these great monks, and we see how happy they are, and we want that. And so, but then there's part of us it's holding us back as well. So there's always going to be that tension there, yeah, until we decide to just kind of do something that we haven't done before, take a leap of faith, yeah. Okay, one more question, yeah.
So the way you're talking about letting go and courage and self-compassion is reminding me of renunciation. Simplicity. And in my experience, it seems sometimes letting go happens kind of while you're not looking. I mean, all of a sudden, I notice something just isn't there, or it's not needed or necessary anymore. And I don't even know if it's necessarily working on it directly. So I think just the general practice must set the groundwork for that.
Yes, absolutely. That's a very good insight. But it doesn't happen without the groundwork. So once that groundwork is there, then that's like the teaching of the carpenter and the rubber-handled hammer that the Buddha uses. He says, when a carpenter, what the practice is like is that when a carpenter is using a hammer with a rubber handle, each day he works, he knows a little bit of that rubber handle has worn away, but he doesn't know how much has worn away. But then he works over the years, and as he works, then it gets more and more worn away, but he doesn't know how much has worn away. But then one day it's worn through, and he knows it is worn through. So but without having worked his whole life, that wouldn't have happened. If he would have just left the hammer in its tool chest and not used it, then that would never have happened. So it's through putting through the work of the practice.
And on the other hand, it seems like if you're trying to get rid of something, that doesn't work either.
Another good insight. Yeah, fear, like, oh, I can't, oh, well, the Buddha said that all things are impermanent, so I can't wait for this particular thing to go away. So that's not quite right. But, or it's like, oh, well, or if we're demanding our mind to let go of something that we're not able to let go of, then that's also not right. But if there's a natural settling and a natural falling away, then that's just a natural result of the practice. But it's also looking at things in a certain way with a certain type of effort. That's the path. So yes, things will fall away if we're following the path. But if our effort isn't right, or we give rise to wrong views, like maybe we think, oh, well, I'm going to take this part of the Buddha's teaching about generosity, but I can't really see this rebirth stuff, so I'm going to reject it. Something like that, where we just take one part of the teaching and reject other parts because we can't see them yet. The more correct way would be to take it as a working hypothesis rather than just say, well, the Buddha must have been speaking metaphorically, and he probably didn't even exist actually, and it's all a fable and a fairy tale, things like that, and then that would cause us to then say, well, I'm just going to take the precepts that I like and not the precepts I don't like. And so then we weren't going to get very far. Okay, so that's the Q&A session. We can take a 10-minute break and come back for one last sitting session. And after that, we'll do the closing. So we have one last 30-minute sitting period. So just to get into whatever meditation posture you prefer, whether it's half lotus, full lotus, or just regular cross-legged with the back straight. Upright, but not uptight. To start the sit, there's a chant I've been doing as of late that I really like. I learned it quite some time ago, but I've been chanting it more recently because it's a different version of the refuge chant. And I'll do it to start off this last sit. And because Bruce was asking about refuge, and we were discussing that a little bit, so it's a very similar to Buddhang Saranang Gacchami, but it's a little bit longer. It's Buddhang Me Jivitang, and that's the first part of it. Buddhang Me Jivitang, and then Yava Nibbanang. So Buddhang Me Jivitang means like for life to the Buddha, and Yava Nibbanang means until Nibbana. Saranang Gacchami, I go for refuge. So I'll do that. Buddha Dhamma Sangha, Dutiyampi Tatiyampi, and anybody here is welcome to follow along if you can catch on to the rhythm and to the way I'm chanting it. Buddhang me jivitang, yavanibbanang, saranang gacchami, dhammang me jivitang, yavanibbanang, saranang gacchami, sanghang me jivitang, yavanibbanang, saranang gacchami, dutiyampi, buddhang me jivitang, yavanibbanang, saranang gacchami, dutiyampi, dhammang me jivitang, yavanibbanang, saranang gacchami, dutiyampi, sanghang me jivitang, yavanibbanang, saranang gacchami, tatiyampi, buddhang me jivitang, yavanibbanang, saranang gacchami, tatiyampi, dhammang me jivitang, yavanibbanang, saranang gacchami, tatiyampi, sanghang me jivitang, yavanibbanang, saranang gacchami. So that concludes our day of practice together. It's always good to gather and practice together for a full day, or at least part of a day. And I wish all of you well in your practices of compassion for yourself and others, and that you can overcome thoughts of cruelty or learn how to cut them off when they arise. And we can do our share for that, at least in the world. And also to remember to depersonalize the Four Noble Truths and learn that when we see suffering, then we can have a courageous form of compassion. Not to try to avoid difficult situations, but know that they're inevitable when they arise. And also remembering the stories of different compassionate teachers in the past, and that can help give us a lot of energy and impetus to our practice. So just say thank you for coming together for today, and whoever may be watching on the YouTube live stream as well, or you'll be able to come back to that later. And just to wish everybody well. And before we do some closing chanting, I'll pass it over to Jill and Bruce for one more time for some closing remarks.
Thank you so much for offering these teachings. I think about all of us here, all of us on Zoom, all on live stream, how lucky we are to have been here together to receive the teachings. I was thinking, I took a retreat once from a southern Thai monk named Ajahn Jamian, and one of the students asked him, "Why am I here? I've taken on this Buddhist practice, but no one in my family has ever done this. How did it happen that I got here?" And I could say that would be true for me too. And his answer was past karma. So maybe that's why we're here. Maybe we had enough good karma to bring us here to these teachings that are so helpful, so insightful, and so clear. So just a huge thank you to you, Ajahn Yanako, and to the community for supporting us. It's been beautiful. One more thing to say is that these teachings are always offered freely. And if you feel that you would like to express your care, concern, your appreciation by offering dana, you can do that on the abhayagiri.org website and go to donations, and you will find a way to donate, and it will be through the Sangapala Foundation. So thank you for considering that. And again, thank you so much, everyone, for being here and helping this day be so wonderful.
For anybody with access to our chanting book, somebody had asked about the meal chant, so we'll turn to page 50. It's just as rivers. Yata varivaha pura paripurindi sagarang, just as rivers full of water entirely fill up the sea. Evam eva ito dinang petanang upakapati. So will what's here been given bring blessings to departed spirits. Ichitang patitang tumhang. May all your hopes and all your longings Kipameva samicatu come true in no long time. Sabe purindu sankapa. May all your wishes be fulfilled. Chando panarasoyata. Like on the 15th day the moon. Mani joti rasoyata. Or like a bright and shining gem. Sabitio vivachantu. May all misfortunes be avoided. Sabarogo vinasatu. May all illness be dispelled. Mate bhavat vantarayo. May you never meet with dangers. Sukhi digayuko bhava. May you be happy and live long. Abhiwadana sili sani changwota pachayino. For those who are respectful, who always honor the elders, Chataro Dhamma Vadanti Ayuwano Sukhang Balang. 4 are the qualities which will increase life, beauty, happiness, and strength. Bhavatu Sabbamangalang. May every blessing come to be. Rakantu Sabadevata. And all good spirits guard you well. Sabbabuddha nubhavena. Through the power of all Buddhas. Sada soti bhavantu te. May you always be at ease. Bhavatu Sabbamangalang. May every blessing come to be. Rakantu Sabadevata. And all good spirits guard you well. Sabbadhamma nubhavena. Through the power of all Dhammas. Sada soti bhavantu te. May you always be at ease. Bhavatu Sabbamangalang. May every blessing come to be. Rakantu Sabadevata. And all good spirits guard you well. Sabba Sangha nubhavena. Through the power of all sanghas. Sada soti bhavantu te. May you always be at ease. Okay, we'll do our closing homage. Alahang Samma Sambuddho Bhagava Buddhang Bhagavantang Abhivademi Soakato Bhagavata Dhammo Dhammang Namasami Supatipanno Bhagavato Sāvaka Saṅgho Saṅghang